students, once again welcome back to class. Today we are doing the second part of your English 1 lesson, that is the last class, and it is on page 39. We had finished up to para 12 in the previous class. Today we shall continue from para 13. So the last class, if you remember, it was about a place in France called Alsace. Alsace is a province in France, and it had been occupied by the Prussians after the Franco-Prussian War, and the Prussians had imposed their language, that is German, in this province of Alsace. So in the previous class, the teacher, that is Monsieur Amel, had made an announcement that that day was to be their last class in French, because the next day Monsieur Amel would be leaving the village for good, and the new teacher would come to their school to teach German. So today we shall continue from para 13 on page 41. So before we go to continue the story itself, I would just like to briefly go through some of the points that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the story. So the setting, meaning where does this story take place? Again, to repeat, the place is called Alsace. Okay, remember, this is a place in France, in the country of France, and so the pronunciation is also slightly different from how we would pronounce it if it was an English word. So, Alsace, and the language is French. The language that is spoken in Alsace is French. The main characters, who are the main characters? Franz, a young boy who goes to the school in Alsace, and the teacher, Monsieur Amel. And then, secondly, the more important point, the theme that we get through this lesson, it is the importance of language. So, continuing from para 13, we shall try to complete this story today. Para 13, let me read and I shall briefly explain it to you. And I barely knew how to write, so I should never learn. How angry I was with myself because of the time I had wasted, the lessons I had missed, looking for nests or sliding on the Saar. My books, which only a moment before I thought so tiresome, so heavy to carry, my grammar, my sacred history, seemed to me now like old friends from whom I should be terribly grieved to part. And it was the same about Monsieur Amel. The thought that he was going away, that I should never see him again, made me forget the punishments, the blows with the ruler. So here, this paragraph talks about how Franz felt when he heard that announcement from Monsieur Amel, his teacher, that it was to be their last class in French. And the regret that he feels when he remembers how he had wasted the opportunity to learn his lessons when things were going well. And also at the same time, it also shows how he feels about his teacher. It seems that Franz, and we can understand that he must have been a mischievous boy. It seems he had bunked class several times to go looking for bird's nests or to go sliding on the banks of the river Saar. So, obviously, he had been punished many times by Monsieur Amel. But now, he is willing to forgive and forget all of that, because he realizes that he will never see Monsieur Amel again. Para 14. Poor man! It was in honor of that last lesson that he had put on his fine Sunday clothes, and I understood now why these old people from the village were sitting at the end of the room. It seemed to me that they regretted not having come oftener to the school. It was also a way of thanking our teacher for his 40 years of faithful service and of paying their respects to the fatherland, which was vanishing. So here in this paragraph, Franz explains how he can understand why Monsieur Hamel was dressed in his best clothes that day, even though he used to wear those clothes only on inspection or prize distribution days. So he understands, he realizes that Monsieur Hamel wore this to honor his last class. And also Franz understands at last why the old villagers, remember old Hauser, and then the ex-mayor, the ex-postman, all of these were seated in the last benches, which usually used to be empty. And he had not understood why they were there, but now he understands that they're there to honor their language and also to honor their teacher, Monsieur Hamel. And also, of course, to pay their respects to their country, the fatherland. Para 15. I was at that point in my reflections when I heard my name called. It was my turn to recite. What would I not have given to be able to say that famous rule about participles in a loud, distinct voice without a slip? But I got mixed up at the first words, and I stood there with a full heart, afraid to raise my hand. So this is what Franz is thinking. Okay, he's reflecting, thinking about all that is happening and going back to the past and regretting all the opportunity that he had. And at that time, he heard his name called by Monsieur Hamel. And remember that when Franz had come to school that day, he suddenly remembered that he had been given a homework on participles. So now he's being called to recite the rule about participles. And as we all know, Franz had not learned. He did not know the first thing about them. So what did he do? He wished that he could have said it all loud and clear, but it seemed that he got mixed up in the first words itself. And he just stood there with a full heart, feeling shame and sorrow, because he had not done what he was supposed to do. And he was afraid to raise his head, knowing that it was his fault. Para 16. I heard Mr. Hamel speaking to me. I won't scold you, my little Franz. You must be punished enough. That's the way it goes. Every day we say to ourselves, psha, I have time, I'll learn tomorrow. And then you see what happens? What? You claim to be French and you can neither speak nor write your language? In all this, my poor Franz, you are not the guiltiest one. Your parents haven't been careful enough to see that you were educated. They preferred to send you to work in the fields or in the factories in order to have a few more sous. And have I nothing to reproach myself for? Have I not often made you water my garden instead of studying? So this is in para 16 and 17. Here, Monsieur Hamel, after seeing that Franz is unable to reply and say the rules about participles, on any other occasion, maybe Monsieur Hamel would have scolded Franz. But on this day, he does not. He speaks sadly and he tells Franz, I won't scold you because you must be feeling bad enough. And then Monsieur Hamel goes on and continues talking about how each and every one of them Franz, his parents, and even he, Monsieur Amel, as a teacher, had neglected in their duties towards learning their own language. So he blames himself, he blames the parents, and he's ready to give that responsibility of not learning. He wants that all of them should share in that blame, and he is very sad. Para 18. Then passing from one thing to another, Monsieur Amel began to talk to us about the French language, saying that it was the most beautiful language in the world, that we must always retain it among ourselves and never forget it, because when a people falls into servitude, so long as it clings to its language, it is as if it held the key to its prison. So in this para, Monsieur Hamel continues to speak about French language, and all of us would like to think of our own language as the most beautiful language in the world. Monsieur Amel thinks the same about the French language. And this line, this sentence is very significant, not only for the French people at that time, but even for us, because right now we're also going through a similar situation that has to do with our mother tongue. So what does he say here? Let me read it again. When a people fall into servitude, so long as it clings to its language, it is as if it held the key to its prison. So here Mr. Amel is stressing the importance of retaining their language and not forgetting it, because our language is our identity. When we lose our language, we lose our identity. Para 19. When the lesson was at an end, we passed to writing. For that day, Mr. Amel had prepared some entirely new cards with examples on which was written France, Alsace, France, Alsace. They were like little flags waving all about the class. You should have seen how hard we all worked and how silent it was. On the roof of the schoolhouse, pigeons cooed in low tones, and I said to myself as I listened to them, I wonder if they are going to compel them to sing in German too. So here, after having taught them that lesson, they are practicing their writing. What do they write? France, Alsace, France, Alsace. So as they were doing that, it seems that there were some pigeons outside who were cooing. And Franz thinks to himself, whether the Prussians who had imposed German on them, the French people, would be able to do it with the birds also. So he asks this question, will the Prussians make them coo in German too? Para 20 and 21. From time to time, when I raised my eyes from my paper, I saw Monsieur Amel sitting in his chair and staring at the objects around him. For 40 years he had been there in the same place with his class, just as it was. What a heart-rending thing it must have been for him to leave all those things, indeed to leave the province forever. However, he had the courage to keep the class to the end. After the writing, we had the lesson in history. Then the little ones sang all together the ba, be, bi, bo, bu. At the back of the room, old Hauser, holding his spelling book in both hands, spelled out the letters with them. His voice shook with emotion, and it was funny to hear him, that we all longed to laugh and cry. Ah, I shall remember that last class. So, as they were writing, Franz looks up and says, Monsieur Amel, looking around the class, because that was going to be his last class. The next day, he was leaving Alsace for good. So Mr. Amel must have felt very emotional as he looks about and realizes that he will never see the place ever once he leaves. And it must have been heart-rending, meaning it must have been such a sorrowful time for him to realize it. So after they did their writing, the little ones sang their French letters. And something to laugh about in this para 21, is where Franz notices old Hauser, if you remember, who was sitting at the last bench. It seems old Hauser was also spelling or singing the Ba Be Bi Bo Boo along with the little children. And the way he did it was so funny, at the same time it was so sad, that those who saw him doing that wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. Para 22 till the end. Suddenly, the church clock struck 12. The bugles of the Prussians blared under our windows. Monsieur Amel rose, pale as death, from his chair. Never had he seemed to me so tall. "My friends," he said. I. But he could not finish the sentence. Thereupon, he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and wrote in the largest letters he could, "Vive la France." What does this mean? Long live France. Then he stood there with his head resting against the wall, and without speaking, he motioned to us with his hand. "This is all. Go." And that is the end of the story. So we can see that it ends on a sad note because everybody realizes that the last class has come to an end. Everybody is feeling very emotional, including Monsieur Amel. He is unable to even finish the sentence that he wanted to tell the students and the villagers. And at last he ends by writing "Vive la France," which is long live France. I hope you have enjoyed the story, and we would like to we will be uploading some of the answers and exercises on your app, so that you can write them down in your exercise books for the purpose of learning. And at the same time, I would like you to go to the story yourself once again. Just read it, enjoy the story, try to understand the theme. What is the theme? As I have told you, the importance of our language. Why we should love our language. Just like France realized, we also should realize that our language is precious and we must never forget it. Thank you. Stay safe, be safe.